Vance Holloway knew something was deeply fractured within Vanguard Core Solutions when he arrived at his desk at 6 in the morning and found a bright neon sticky note pasted flat across his primary computer monitor. It read, "Client Sync reassigned to Julian, smiley face included." Vance was 54 years old and had spent 10 dedicated years as Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships. He carried the company's complex enterprise integration architecture like a quiet Sherpa, completely invisible during routine operations until a multi-million-dollar transaction began to fray. Julian Thorne, on the other hand, was 27 years old, wore immaculate tailored Italian swole suits that looked as though they were cropped from a luxury fashion catalog, and could not successfully negotiate a standard vendor licensing agreement, let alone represent Vanguard to a Fortune 50 corporate enterprise. Yet Julian was CFO Victoria Thorne's biological nephew, and in Victoria's eyes, family bloodline superseded 10 long years of flawless executive execution. Vance peeled the neon note off his glass display, crumpled it calmly, dropped it into his mug of lukewarm black coffee, and returned his fingers to the keyboard. He looked around the quiet, dimly lit 12th floor of the corporate headquarters. At this early hour, the high-rise office tower was serene and empty, save for the low rhythmic hum of the building's central HVAC ventilation system and the distant flicker of morning city traffic far below. Vance had spent hundreds of early mornings sitting in this exact office over the past decade, when Vanguard was merely a struggling mid-market technology entity trying to compete against massive global conglomerates. Vance had been the principal architect who personally structured their foundational strategic alliances. He had designed the core compliance frameworks, established the cross-border risk management protocols, and negotiated master service agreements with major institutional partners across North America, Europe, and Asia. His work was meticulous, understated, and mathematically precise, ensuring that every legal loop was secured and every asset protected. At 7 minutes past 6 in the morning, corporate legal pinged his secure terminal in an absolute panic. A critical non-disclosure agreement and intellectual property schedule for a $40 million defense supply chain partnership had been submitted to external auditing regulators without its mandatory risk mitigation annex. Vance did not waste precious time asking which incompetent junior manager had committed such an amateur blunder. He immediately opened the master contract repository, updated the classified draft, verified the digital encryption signatures, looped in General Counsel Eleanor Rhodes, and triple-blind carbon copied his personal archive server for total documentation. No senior executive sent a thank you message. No one acknowledged the early morning save. 20 minutes later, Julian posted a public message in the company-wide executive Slack channel, claiming full credit for successfully clearing the defense contract review before breakfast. Vance stared at the glowing screen without the slightest change in expression. He was not angry. He was simply exhausted in the way old foundation beams become exhausted, holding up a massive roof while moisture silently rots the timber behind fresh paint. For 10 continuous years, Vance had operated in the silent background of Vanguard Core Solutions. He was the quiet technical authority who stepped out of procurement calls to intercept sensitive physical prototype blueprints sent by unencrypted courier services. He was the seasoned strategist who talked down furious aerospace clients when junior sales executives accidentally promised 5 full years of unbilled technical support. He locked the master database architecture so only authenticated credentials could modify pricing tiers or adjust operational schedules. Vance spent his weekends drafting legal compliance frameworks and reviewing complex international trade regulations to ensure the firm remained entirely unassailable during rigorous federal audits. He understood every hidden vulnerability in Vanguard's operational armor because he had laboriously forged the armor himself, piece by piece. Yet, during executive committee meetings, Vance was treated like a folding chair, necessary to have in the room whenever catastrophic operational crises erupted, but entirely forgotten whenever annual bonuses and executive accolades were distributed. CFO Victoria Thorne, who had not directly negotiated a complex transaction in nearly a decade, routinely claimed credit for Vance's groundwork. During the previous quarter, when Vance single-handedly secured a $65 million telecommunications contract with a major Asian conglomerate after 3 grueling months of midnight conference calls. Victoria had presented the final signed deal to the board of directors as her personal strategic victory. Vance had allowed it to slide, preferring operational stability, client success, and quiet professional craftsmanship over petty corporate office politics. That enduring tolerance came to a definitive end on a rainy Tuesday morning during the Q3 Executive Roadmap meeting. 18 senior vice presidents, department heads, and regional operational directors were gathered inside the glass-walled boardroom on the 12th floor of the corporate tower. Outside, gray rain streaks ran down the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city center. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with corporate posture and carefully curated executive vanity. Julian Thorne sat directly to the immediate right of CFO Victoria Thorne, holding an organic kale smoothie like a theatrical prop and tapping his expensive fountain pen against his silk tie. Julian spent 40 tedious minutes reading bullet points off a PowerPoint presentation he clearly had not authored himself, stumbling over basic financial concepts and repeatedly mispronouncing standard industry terminology. When a member of the advisory board raised a sharp technical question regarding capital reserve requirements, liability provisions, and vertical integration exposure, Julian froze like a deer caught in high-beam headlights, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single coherent sentence. Instead of allowing her privileged nephew to drown in his obvious incompetence, CFO Victoria Thorne pivoted with cold surgical malice. She smiled smoothly around the executive table, flipped a page in her bound leather binder, and fixed her eyes directly upon Vance. "Well," Victoria announced in a loud, deliberate voice that echoed off the glass walls of the silent room, "at least Julian brings modern energy, youthful charisma, and fresh client appeal to our operational division. Vance here is essentially office decor. Legacy people slow down fast-paced deal structures and obstruct dynamic growth." A few junior managers chuckled nervously. One senior operations director coughed quietly into his hand, shifting uncomfortably in his ergonomic leather chair. Vance did not flinch. He did not raise his voice, change his posture, or offer a witty, sarcastic retort. He sat perfectly still, absorbing the public humiliation with cool composure. He looked straight at Victoria, then down at his workstation, and slowly closed his laptop. The mechanical click of the latch was soft, almost imperceptible in the spacious room, but inside Vance's mind, a heavy iron vault door slid shut permanently. 10 years of unquestioned corporate loyalty vanished in less than 5 seconds. CFO Victoria Thorne had just made the fatal career mistake of underestimating the quiet strategist who held every master credential key to Vanguard's enterprise foundation. Vance walked over to his corner window, holding his mug of black coffee, watching the dawn sun pierce through the heavy morning clouds. Over the last decade, he had worked 80 hours a week, building Vanguard's strategic partnership network from scratch. When he first walked into this building, Vanguard had only 3 regional clients and a struggling product line. Vance had leveraged his personal industry contacts, established robust risk-sharing frameworks, and built an automated governance pipeline that allowed the company to scale without taking on unhedged liabilities. He had mentored dozens of young associates, quietly guiding them through complex regulatory filings and teaching them how to negotiate with seasoned institutional buyers. Yet, as the company grew into a multi-hundred-million-dollar enterprise, senior management began replacing quiet operational excellence with flashy corporate PR and superficial executive branding. Victoria Thorne, in particular, viewed Vance's quiet, disciplined approach as an outdated relic of an earlier era. She favored charismatic charlatans who excelled at creating glossy slide decks while ignoring the underlying legal and operational dependencies that kept the business solvent. Vance took a slow sip of his coffee. The contrast between his methodical, quiet diligence and the superficial theater of the executive suite had never been starker. For 10 years, he had quietly reviewed every contract clause, every liability waiver, and every compliance audit before the C-suite even knew a document existed. He was the invisible shield that protected Vanguard from catastrophic lawsuits, SEC inquiries, and contractual breaches. Yet Victoria Thorne treated enterprise management like a stage play where titles were handed out as party favors to family members. Vance placed his coffee mug down on the wooden desk, looking out at the skyline. He felt no resentment, only a cold, crystalline clarity. If Victoria wanted to strip away the foundation to showcase decorative wallpaper, he would step aside and let gravity do its work. Following the disastrous roadmap meeting, Julian's official corporate promotion announcement landed in every employee inbox at precisely 1 minute past 9 in the morning. The formal subject line proclaimed Julian Thorne as Executive Director of Global Strategic Accounts, complete with a high-resolution professional headshot that looked more like an agency modeling portfolio than an executive biography. Julian was pictured wearing an open-collared designer shirt, sporting a meticulously groomed shadow beard, and gazing into the distance with blank confidence. 8 minutes later, Vance received a brief, cold email from department management stating that all strategic client interactions were to be routed exclusively through Julian going forward. Vance was effectively relegated to administrative oversight, shoved into the background to silently babysit the CFO's privileged relative while maintaining back-end operational integrity. By noon on that same day, Julian had already scheduled an urgent alignment meeting to discuss synergy touchpoints, which was corporate jargon for demanding that Vance explain basic enterprise logistics to him as if he were a child wearing an expensive Bluetooth headset. Vance sat quietly through 45 minutes of Julian misusing elementary financial concepts like capitalization tables, debt covenants, and net operating revenue. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, swinging his designer shoes onto a coffee table, and casually announced that his aunt, CFO Victoria Thorne, was quietly preparing a massive internal restructuring initiative to streamline legacy positions across the entire corporation within 30 days. Vance merely nodded his head in silent acknowledgement, taking careful mental note of the proposed restructuring timeline. Later that afternoon, a glossy digital company newsletter circulated throughout the enterprise, featuring a full-page photo of Julian shaking hands with the senior vice president of Solis Freight International, a key legacy account that Vance had personally onboarded 6 years earlier after 6 months of intense legal negotiations. When Julian walked past Vance's office later that day, holding another green smoothie, he grinned with smug satisfaction. "Hey Vance, did you see the corporate newsletter today? Pretty impressive photo, right? They picked the exact shot I wanted." Vance did not look up from his workstation display. "The one where your mouth is kept shut? Smart editorial choice," Vance replied in a calm, flat tone. Julian tapped his manicured fingers on the doorframe, completely failing to grasp the sharp insult, pointed finger guns playfully, and sauntered down the corridor humming a pop song. That evening, Vance remained in his office long after the 12th floor had emptied and the evening cleaning crew had begun vacuuming the hallways. He logged into his private technical audit ledger and began systematically reviewing Vanguard's active enterprise contracts. Years earlier, prior to joining Vanguard Core Solutions, Vance had independently written and copyrighted a proprietary database authentication index routine. When he accepted his executive position 10 years ago, he had granted Vanguard a non-exclusive operational license while retaining full personal copyright ownership under Title 17, United States Code, Section 106. This custom authentication code served as the invisible core architecture for Vanguard's automated client renewal portal and strategic contract validation engine. Without valid authentication credentials linked to Vance's personal strategic index, automated account renewals could not process legally or technically. Vance opened the master contract repository for Solis Freight International, an enterprise account representing $35 million in annual recurring service revenue. He discovered that Julian had already drafted an unapproved contract addendum, guaranteeing Solis Freight early commercial access to an unreleased real-time logistics tracking software platform by August. The software platform was still in early alpha testing and suffered from severe architectural bugs, unencrypted data pipelines, and database query crashes. In his reckless eagerness to impress the client, Julian had guaranteed a firm commercial launch date without consulting engineering leads or corporate risk management. Furthermore, Julian and CFO Victoria Thorne had executed a formal sign-off removing a crucial liability fail-safe clause from the Solus Freight Agreement. That specific clause, which Vance had carefully embedded 2 years earlier during merger renegotiations, protected Vanguard from catastrophic breach of contract penalties if software deployments experienced technical delays or security failures. Victoria had dismissed the clause as unnecessary red tape that impeded rapid deal execution and slowed down quarterly financial reporting. She had signed off on the amendment without looping in legal or conducting a risk assessment. Vance made no attempt to correct Julian's dangerous error. He did not notify Victoria, nor did he alert General Counsel Eleanor Rhodes. Instead, Vance opened his private authentication ledger and made a precise annotation under the Solus Freight account record. Service continuation contingent on active executive index certification. He quietly updated his personal authentication credential status from active to pending semi-annual review. He deleted no files and modified no core code. He simply permitted the enterprise's statutory and contractual framework to operate strictly according to its unedited legal parameters, knowing that the automated compliance systems would execute their programming without emotion or delay. Later that night, sitting in his home study, Vance reviewed the full text of Title 17, United States Code, Section 106. When he had joined Vanguard 10 years ago, his personal attorney had insisted on inserting a strict non-exclusive software licensing clause into his employment agreement. The clause explicitly stipulated that any proprietary algorithms, custom index frameworks, or technical database routines engineered by Vance prior to his employment, remained his sole intellectual property. Vanguard was granted an operational license that remained valid only so long as Vance maintained active executive certification over the Strategic Accounts Division. If Vanguard ever decommissioned his executive certification channel, the operational license would automatically revert to a pending status, requiring formal semi-annual reauthorization. Victoria Thorne had never bothered to read Vance's original employment contract or its technical addendums. In her rush to strip Vance of his authority and hand the division to her nephew, she had executed an administrative restructuring that triggered the automatic reversion clause. Over the next 2 weeks, Vance executed a quiet, surgical extraction of his daily operational presence across the company. He systematically canceled all recurring internal synchronization meetings that did not strictly require his personal administrative credentials. He disabled instant messaging notifications and marked his electronic calendar as unavailable during 4 hours of focus time every morning. When junior project managers submitted requests for access to legacy contract archives, Vance politely provided links to read-only repositories containing expired access keys. Nothing he did could ever be characterized as sabotage, insubordination, or neglect of duty. He was merely complying with Victoria's explicit directive to transition fully into a back-office administrative role. Without Vance's invisible, daily maintenance, tiny structural fractures began spreading rapidly across Vanguard's enterprise operations. The corporate marketing department struggled to coordinate major webinar launches because their promotional milestones were hard-coded to client deployment schedules that Vance used to manage manually. The procurement division failed to reconcile quarterly budget projections because Vance was no longer available to translate complex vendor service agreements or clarify hidden pricing tiers for them. Key vendor negotiations stalled because external legal teams refused to accept contract drafts authored by junior associates who did not understand regional compliance protocols. The first major operational tremor struck on a humid Thursday afternoon. Executives at Solus Freight International submitted an urgent high-priority inquiry to Julian regarding the promised real-time tracking software deployment. The client demanded formal written confirmation that the alpha software would go live by the end of the month as guaranteed in Julian's signed addendum. Julian, lacking any technical comprehension of software development life cycles, issued a vague email reassuring the client that everything was proceeding on schedule. while frantically messaging the engineering department behind the scenes. Engineering lead Brian Scott, a veteran developer who had worked alongside Vance for 8 years, informed Julian, in plain terms, that the tracking software was at least 6 months away from commercial deployment and that releasing the buggy build now would expose client data to severe security breaches. Panicking over his exposed mistake, Julian's attempted to shield himself by issuing an internal compliance memo, claiming the miscommunication had originated from an erroneous analytical slide prepared by the corporate data analytics team. Brian Scott brought the memo to Vance's desk, shaking his head in disbelief. Vance looked at the memo, smiled mildly, and advised Brian to archive all technical audit logs for future legal discovery. Meanwhile, Solis Freight's automated annual contract renewal date arrived. Under the governing terms of Vanguard's master service agreement, automated contract rollovers required active executive index certification. Because Vance had previously updated his personal authentication status to pending review, the system's automated compliance engine triggered an immediate security lockdown. Solis Freight's corporate access portal locked automatically, flagging the account as non-compliant due to unverified strategic credentials. By Friday morning, Solis Freight was completely unable to log into Vanguard's system, to process their monthly service payments or view active shipment manifests. Within hours, 2 additional legacy accounts, representing $25 million in combined quarterly revenue, hit identical credential flags and entered immediate administrative lockdown. Inside the executive suite, panic spread rapidly across the floor. Senior financial analysts reported a sudden 5% drop in Q3 projected cash flows. A junior financial analyst rushed into Vance's office, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Hey Vance, Solis Freight's renewal portal is throwing a major credential error and locking the account. Can you log into the admin console and execute a quick override?" Vance swiveled slowly in his ergonomic chair, offering a polite, measured smile. "I am strictly back-office administrative oversight now," Vance replied in a smooth, quiet voice. "Julian handles all strategic client operations and contract index management. You should consult him directly." The analyst stood frozen in shock for several seconds before turning and running down the hallway toward Victoria's corner office. As the afternoon progressed, news of Solis Freight's portal lockout sent shockwaves through the finance department. Solis Freight was not merely a major client, it was Vanguard's anchor customer, providing the steady, recurring revenue stream that underpinned the firm's quarterly dividend payments. When Solis Freight's procurement directors discovered that their automated payment processing was blocked and their tracking interface was inaccessible, they immediately contacted their outside legal counsel. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ardent Global and Solis Freight had both issued formal notices of administrative default, demanding that Vanguard demonstrate compliance with their master service agreements within 24 hours or face immediate contract termination and statutory damages. At 20 minutes past 10 on Monday morning, CFO Victoria Thorne burst through Vance's office door without knocking. Her face was flushed dark red, her designer blazer rumpled, and her eyes wide with uncontained panic. She clutched a thick stack of color-coded financial spreadsheets in one shaking hand and her mobile phone in the other. "2 of our largest enterprise accounts are completely locked out," Victoria demanded, her voice straining at a high pitch. Solis Freight and Ardent Global both failed automated contract renewal this morning. Investor guidance is about to tank before the quarterly earnings call. What is happening with the system? Vance remained entirely motionless. He finished typing a sentence in an email draft, saved it calmly, and leaned back in his leather chair. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a small silver tin of mints, and offered one to Victoria. "Mint?" he asked softly. Victoria slammed her hand onto his desk, scattering financial printouts across the wood surface. "This is not a game, Vance. Legal is breathing down my neck, and the chief technology officer says these renewal locks are tied to custom credential index keys that only your account controls. Fix this immediately." Vance tapped the silver mint tin twice against his desk before setting it down. As I explained following the Q3 roadmap meeting, legacy contract index keys require active strategic certification alignment, Vance stated in a glacial tone. When you restructured client management to Julian, my executive access channel was decommissioned under your streamlining initiative. You explicitly informed the executive committee that legacy people were merely office decor. Victoria's face turned from crimson red to pale white. You are intentionally sabotaging this firm, she screamed. If I take this directly to the board of directors, you will be terminated immediately for gross corporate misconduct. Vance's expression did not change. If you take this to the board of directors, he replied with razor-sharp precision, you will have to explain why you transferred $45 million in strategic client accounts to an unqualified family member who signed unauthorized contract addendums without legal authorization. You will also have to explain why you personally authorized the removal of liability, fail-safe clauses, committing a direct breach of fiduciary duty under corporate law. Furthermore, your confidential plan to execute mass employee restructuring next month without 60 days statutory written notice violates the Federal Warning Act under Title 29, United States Code, Section 2101. That creates immediate, unhedged federal statutory liability for the corporation. Victoria stared at Vance in stunned silence, her chest heaving as the gravity of his words landed. She realized in an instant that Vance had not committed a single illegal act. He had merely stepped back and allowed her own gross negligence and statutory violations to become fully visible. Vance reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a small bottle of lavender lotion, and applied a tiny drop to his hands with slow, deliberate precision. I suggest you consult General Counsel Eleanor Rhodes immediately, Vance added gently, and perhaps corporate communications. Solis Freight has already retained outside legal counsel regarding breach of contract. At 41 minutes past 9 the following morning, Vance drafted a single, precise email to CEO Gordon Prescott. The subject line read, Deal 458 Changelog Audit. The email body contained exactly 5 words. Recommend reviewing deal changelogs. 18 minutes later, the CEO's furious voice echoed down the executive corridor like thunder. Who authorized these clause removals? Prescott screamed, throwing his boardroom door open. Who signed off on these unhedged corporate liabilities? Within 10 minutes, Prescott's executive assistant sprinted into Vance's office, breathless and pale. Vance, the CEO needs you in the main boardroom right now. Vance smiled softly. Tell him I am preparing my file, Vance replied. When Victoria stormed out of Vance's office, her heels clicking rapidly against the polished marble floor, Vance calmly closed his desk drawer. He picked up his pen and made a final entry in his personal notebook. He had documented every single meeting, every forwarded email, and every compliance warning he had issued over the past 6 months. He knew that when external auditors and regulatory authorities investigated the sudden contract defaults, his audit trail would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had acted with complete professional propriety. CFO Victoria Thorne had dug her own administrative grave, fueled by vanity, nepotism, and reckless disregard for legal compliance. The emergency executive board meeting convened at 7:30 the following morning, under an atmosphere of intense corporate crisis. The glass-walled boardroom felt like a courtroom before the reading of a criminal verdict. CFO Victoria Thorne's leather chair sat vacant. Her polished brass nameplate had been removed overnight, following an exhaustive 6-hour emergency audit conducted by external legal counsel and forensic accountants. Formal announcements indicated that Victoria had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending an investigation into breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized contract modifications, and financial misrepresentation. Julian Thorne sat near the far end of the conference table, sweating profusely through his high-end dress shirt. When CEO Gordon Prescott demanded that Julian explain his client management protocols and justify why he had guaranteed unreleased software to Solis Freight, Julian launched into a frantic, incoherent stream of corporate buzzwords. He stammered about agile synergy, vertical integration, and paradigm optimization. Mid-sentence, the overwhelming psychological stress caused Julian's nose to bleed heavily. He panicked, frantically blotting his face with his shirt sleeve, and attempted to continue speaking while bright red blood soaked into his white collar. The entire board of directors watched in horrified silence as Julian's artificial corporate persona collapsed completely. CEO Gordon Prescott turned to face Vance, his expression heavy with deep embarrassment and regret. "Vance," Prescott declared, addressing the assembled board, "Vanguard committed a catastrophic operational error when management restructured our strategic partnerships division. Your technical architecture, legal risk management, and contractual oversight were far more integrated into our corporate stability than executive leadership ever appreciated. We are offering you an immediate promotion to Executive Vice President, complete authority over all global strategic operations, a substantial equity grant, and total latitude to restructure the division as you see fit." The board members stared at Vance, eagerly awaiting his acceptance. Vance sat perfectly still, his countenance peaceful and unbothered. He displayed neither smug triumph nor lingering resentment. He simply looked at the CEO, offered a respectful nod of his head, and slowly closed his laptop. "I appreciate the generous offer, Mr. Prescott," Vance said in a clear, quiet voice. "However, my proprietary authentication index license officially expired when my executive access channel was decommissioned under the restructuring initiative." Vance stood up smoothly, picked up his leather briefcase, and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. He did not return to his office. He had already packed his personal belongings the previous evening. He walked down to the Human Resources Department, handed his security clearance badge to a bewildered assistant, and uploaded a final encrypted file archive to the legal server labeled Legacy Index Archive. In the system summary notes field, he typed one final sentence: "Decor breaks easily. Handle with care." As Vance stepped into the parking garage elevator, automated compliance alarms began chiming softly across the 12th floor. Red alert indicators flickered on network administration consoles as automated system triggers registered the final expiration of unverified vendor keys. Vance walked out into the crisp morning air, got into his car, and drove away from Vanguard Core Solutions for the last time. He had burned no bridges, committed no violations, and raised no voice. He had simply allowed truth and legal precision to take their course, leaving behind a shattered executive tower that would never again confuse quiet competence with office decor. As Vance drove out of the corporate parking garage onto the open highway, he felt a profound sense of calm and freedom. For 10 years, he had carried the weight of Vanguard Core Solutions on his shoulders, sacrificing his personal time, his health, and his peace of mind to protect an ungrateful executive suite. Now, the burden was lifted. Within 2 hours of his departure, his phone began ringing with calls from competing enterprise firms, board members from former client companies, and prominent venture capital partners who knew his true value. Vance smiled, adjusted his sunglasses, and let the calls go straight to voicemail. His quiet tenure as office decor was officially over, and a new chapter of unconstrained professional freedom had just begun. Back inside the boardroom, the silence following Vance's departure was complete. CEO Gordon Prescott sat staring at the empty doorway, his face pale and drained of color. The remaining board members looked around the room in mounting panic as the reality of their situation dawned on them. Without Vance's proprietary index credentials, the entire client renewal architecture was locked in an indefinite administrative hold. Rebuilding the database framework from scratch would take at least 8 months and cost tens of millions of dollars in consulting fees, all while major clients walked away to competitors. Julian Thorne sat in the corner, still dabbing his bloodied nose with a crumpled tissue, completely ignored by everyone. The executive tower, built on years of quiet engineering and legal precision, was collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance.